It's always been quite an experience to watch a movie in 3D. Perhaps somewhere along the line you've had that experience. More and more movies are coming out in 3D. It used to be that they were pretty poor, but still there was a 3D promise of something exciting and dramatic. You got the special glasses, and you know, if you've been to Disney, they have really great 3D presentations. With 3D, the movie seems exceptionally real and alive. You know what the 3Ds are, the 3 dimensions in 3D? Height, width, and depth. And rather than seeing it flat, it captures all those dimensions. I want to talk tonight about a 4th dimension. And instead of seeing in 4D, I'm going to suggest how we can live in 4D. We can live a 4-dimensional life. And suggesting that 4th dimension is the dimension of the Spirit. And the passage I want us to think about was from Luke 2, verse 52. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. And what that means is he grew intellectually. He grew intellectually. And you saw that in the passage. He engaged with the rabbis. And he grew in that mental process that's cognitive or intellectual or mental. He also grew in stature. And that is, he grew he grew physically. So he grew in his mental life, he grew in his body life, and also he grew in favor with God. He grew in his spiritual life, and he grew in favor with man. He grew socially or in his relational life as well. I first learned this passage a number of years ago. I was at a meeting, I don't even know how or where, but somehow I was with a group from Young Life. Young Life is a Christian campus ministry, high school ministry. And I'll never forget, the group leader led a devotional on this passage, Luke 2:52. And he was telling the group, most of whom were younger than I at the time, what this means. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. And you look at these 4 different dimensions of the intellectual life, the physical life, the spiritual life, and the social life. And Jesus lived a balanced life. And that was the premise, and that was the teaching from this passage. It was about the balanced life that Jesus lived. And for years, I assumed that that was on track, and I assumed that that was accurate. But I got to thinking more about it, and more about kind of how he lived his life and how we are to live our life. And what occurred to me was, if he lived a balanced life, that meant that he would be growing in all those areas equally, right? He would grow in wisdom and in stature and in favor with all equally if he were to live a balanced life. I mean, it makes an interesting, simple, and maybe helpful teaching, but it's not accurate. For that to happen, that would mean that Jesus would have had to spend as much time and energy in the library or in interacting with the rabbis as he would in the gym, as he would at church, and as he would socializing. That would be balance. But the primary point in this passage is not that Jesus grew in all of these areas equally, which would mean balance. It is that he grew in all of these areas. Doesn't say anything in there about balance. It says he grew in all of these areas. And in fact, when it comes to being or living a balanced life, Jesus didn't. His life was in fact unbalanced in his passion, love, and attention toward the Father. There were a number of times he upset his family. Remember, this was the first, I've got to be about my Father's business. Why are you surprised that I'm here? And later on, when he was doing his public ministry, the family said, son, it's time to just forget about this messianic craziness and time to come home. And one of his friends said, well, Lord, your family's here. He said, who's my family? My family are my followers. They're my family. And he said, a man's enemies will be those of his own household. So where's the balance there between following God and keeping peace with the family? His life was out of balance. Being loved by the Father and allowing that love to penetrate his heart so that he could love people with the Father's love. This was the consuming passion of his life, even if it upset his family and his friends. Which it did. Peter was upset more than once. Peter, I'm going to have to go, and I'm going to have to go to the cross. I'm going to die. Oh Lord, you can't die. You can't leave us. Get behind me, Satan. Said to his friend Peter. His consuming passion was to live life for his Father. In his Father's love. But let's take a look at this snippet here for a minute in this passage and ask the question, what was so inviting and so compelling and so attractive about his Father's house? Even now we sometimes refer to church buildings as God's house. Maybe not as much as generations prior, but you still, you still talk to some people. Yes, I'm going to God's house today. Well, in Jesus' time, it really was God's house. It was the temple. And the temple contained, among other things, among other artifacts, the temple contained the Ark of the Covenant. Ark of the Covenant, that makes a good movie. Searching for the Ark of the Covenant. Too late, yeah, it's in 3D. But where the wings, you remember the movie? You remember the picture? The wings of the angels? And where they touch, where the angel wings touch in this artifact was called the Shekinah glory. And what that meant was that in some unique way, the powerful and palpable presence of God was right there. And that's what the Shekinah glory meant. And that was such a holy thing and such a holy place that only the great high priest could enter the Holy of Holies where the ark was kept. Could only enter it once a year and had to go through elaborate preparations. And in fact, it was such a holy place that if by chance the high priest, wasn't holy enough to go into the holy place and died, nobody could go in after him. They tied a cord to his foot, and if he passed out in the presence of God, they'd have to pull him out from outside that holy place. My point is To them, God was there. That was his house. And he was there. And God's house was attractive and inviting to Jesus simply because that's where God lives in unique ways. But it is not where God lives now. Remember, the temple was destroyed. What was 63 AD by the Romans? The temple was destroyed. So there isn't even a place, a building in which God could live there in Jerusalem. But even more important, you are the temple now in which God lives. You are the temple in which God lives. The Shekinah glory is no longer in that temple. He now dwells in you. Everything you know about the power and the beauty and the majesty and the glory, the holiness and the love of God now lives in you. So you are as attractive and as inviting to Jesus as the temple was to him then. I want to be in my Father's house, and that's you, and that's me. We are his Father's house now. Secondly, he wanted to be with people who knew God. He wanted to be with people who could speak the language of God and teach him of God, the great truths that were expressed through Scripture and through God's history, God's story. And for us, the Christian social life, or fellowship as we call it, or community as we call it, means we hang out with other people who know God. Some not as well as I do, some better than I do, but either way, either group can help me to grow. I've always liked this passage, Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. That's what our fellowship, that's what our community, that's what our gathering together is designed to do, to spur us toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another. And I learned this teaching a long time ago, and I think it was a little booklet, the 4 Spiritual Laws by Campus Crusade for Christ. You have the wood burning in the campfire. And the wood, the fire, gives off warmth and light and provides safety for the people around it. Remove a piece of wood from the flame, and it goes from being firewood to being dead wood. And we can complain about the church, and we can complain about Christians, and we can remove and isolate ourselves from other Christ followers. We remove ourselves from the warmth and the light and the safety of the community of faith, and we go from being firewood to dead wood. See, it's being together that keeps us going, that keeps us energized with the warmth of God. We support each other. We encourage one another. Consider how we may spur. I thought it was cute, cowboys spur, But consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Again, that's why we meet together, to spur, to encourage, maybe to stick. Keep us moving toward love and good work. Jesus knew that he was going to be compassionate toward people. He would first have to know, not just intellectually or experientially, he would have to know the passionate love his Father had for him. Because we know it's true. We do become like the people we hang around with. It is a law of nature. It's a law of human nature. It means choose your friends carefully. They will powerfully and profoundly choose the people you hang around with. If you want to move toward God, choose to hang around with people who are moving toward God. If you don't care, hang around people who don't care. If you want to move away from God, hang around people who are moving away from God. It's that simple. One of my mentors as a counselor is a psychologist, Larry Craft, a Coloradan, lives in a suburb of, where was the Columbine shooting? Littleton. He lives near Littleton. He is at Colorado Christian University, and one of these days I'll show you a cool picture with Larry when I'm less humble than I am now. But it was fun to meet him. I spent a week with him and a group of people last year. And one of his books, the book entitled Connecting, one of the textbooks that I require students in one of the counseling classes I teach to read. And it's been interesting to follow Larry's evolution, if you will, from a Christian psychologist to a committed Christian who's leading people to deeper life in the Spirit, who also happens to be a psychologist. You know what I mean? And but here's one of his quotes. When members of a spiritual community reach a sacred place of vulnerability and authenticity, something is released. Something good begins to happen. An appetite for holy things is stirred. For just a moment, the longing to know God becomes intense, stronger than all other passion. That's unbalanced, right? Worth whatever price must be paid for it. And there are a number of parables that Jesus taught that. The parable of the pearl of great price. You know, you give up everything to get that one. That's not balance. That's passion. To know God, for just a moment, the longing to know God becomes intense, stronger than all other passions, worth whatever price must be paid for it. Spiritual togetherness, what I call connecting, creates movement. Togetherness in Christ encourages movement toward Christ. In other words, for me to continue my process of moving in Jesus, moving toward Jesus, I need you. I need you. I need you to be in that same process of moving toward Jesus and growing toward Jesus, so that you and I can move kind of in one another's wake. You know, have you ever been on a boat or even a cruise ship and you see the dolphins swimming in the cut, the fresh wake of the boat? That's what we are to do. As Jesus leads, we are to follow in his wake. A 4D life, a four-dimensional life is not a balanced life. A balanced life lacks power and passion. No one can accuse Olympic athletes or concert musicians or Nobel Prize winners or inventors or explorers of living a balanced life. Their passion becomes their identity. It shapes them, it flavors them, it defines their life. Their life is intentionally out of balance because of the passion that they have for that one thing. As followers of Jesus, we are passionate lovers of the God who passionately loves us. So we love one another then with compassion and Spirit-empowered service. And I want to conclude with this thought. People who believe passionately, hear what I'm saying? people who believe passionately are dangerous. That's where fanatics and terrorists and assassins come from. People who have a passionate belief. But people who are passionately loved by God and love people passionately. These are people who work to build hospitals, and people who feed the poor, and people who build wells in the desert, and people who give their lives in service and ministry to other people. These people are crazy. These people are people